health warning, these are bad Jews. So the bad Jews, Anthony and Caitlin, they run a very, very interesting podcast called The Bad Jews. And you can pick it up wherever you pick up your podcasts, Apple platform, Spotify, Instagram, and so on. And they come out fairly regularly with extremely interesting Jewish topics and Jewish conversations. So without further ado, there will be question and answer time afterwards, of course. Without further ado, Anthony and Caitlin.
Hello. So I think quite a lot of people here know us already. But for those who don't and who don't know our podcast, as Basil said, Caitlin, Anthony, I think important framing point here is that we're anti-Zionist Jews. And in a way, that's kind of what it means, the name of our podcast, that we're Jews who speak from that perspective, but with an interest in speaking more broadly to other Jews about questions that Jews think about in general. When we were asked to participate in this festival, a topic that we've been thinking about speaking about on our podcast and what we're going to have a chat about today is liberal Zionism. So we're going to do it sort of how we normally would. We're going to have a chat about liberal Zionism, and then we're going to open up to the floor and hear what other people think on the matter. And the way it's going to work is we're going to start, I think, with a discussion on what we think of liberalism, what we think of Zionism, how they fit together, and essentially why we don't really think that they're compatible, and why it's harmful to try and put them together. But I suppose I did want to say, this is not your first time on the Jewish Festival of Dangerous Ideas, is it?
No.
So
regular.
Yeah. So you're just...
I was lucky enough to speak at the last year's festival, so you can catch those recordings on YouTube too.
So you just have lots of dangerous ideas.
I do, yeah.
Well, hopefully today our ideas won't actually scare you that much, because even though we call ourselves the Bad Jews podcast, we're not really bad Jews.
Yeah, I actually wanted to say, I mean, a lot of you I've seen at events, but just some background in terms of Anthony and I, we call ourselves kind of ironically or tongue-in-cheek the Bad Jews podcast, just because that's the label that's often thrown onto us, given that we take a different position on Zionism and Israel. But we are both kind of, we grew up in the Cape Town Jewish community. We both went to Herzliya for 12 years. We, do feel Habonim as well. Habonim did come up earlier. I think I credit Habonim with a lot of my kind of political education.
Habonim made you a bad Jew.
I don't want to put Habonim in it. But all this to say, we do both have a kind of very strong Jewish identity. It just might be a Jewish identity that's different from the kind of what comes out of the mainstream. So we don't actually think we're bad Jews. We don't accept the label, but we feel quite passionately about some of the issues that the community is having to navigate and want to play a role in being a part of that conversation. And I think the JDI space creates that really well.
Yeah. And so on to the topic of discussion, liberal Zionism. And there's obviously two parts to liberal Zionism. There's the liberalism and the Zionism. And there's also a question about, can they fit together? How do they fit together? I mean, I suppose to start just with liberalism, which in some ways is simpler. Liberalism means different things to different people in different parts of the world. It's meant different things in different stages of history. In the anti-apartheid literature, you often find people talking about liberal and left as interchangeable. Nowadays, there's a big disconnect, and leftists don't want to be called liberals and vice versa. But I think to have a conversation about liberal Zionism, we need to start with it like, well, what do we mean when we're analyzing this word in connection to Zionism and Israel? And I think the simplest way, and this is probably not going to be very controversial, look, if in broad strokes, if you look at the political history of liberalism as an ideology, it's like 18th and 19th and 20th century old men called John Locke and John Stuart Mill and John Rawls, the Johns who came up with ideas which not everyone knows, but I think originally actually were a response to a kind of European ethnic and religious supremacism that was leading to war. And these early liberal thinkers were sort of thinking, well, how do we create a human value system that protects everyone and doesn't, so, I mean, that's already hinting at perhaps where our conversation is heading towards. But fundamentally, in terms of like the in practice values of liberals, and I think there's probably many people in this room who think of themselves as liberals, of course, it's named after the value of liberty, freedom. Equality is the one that comes up next, almost always, essential to liberals. And there's different ways in which it comes up to whatever the John Locke liberalism of the social contract or the JSM utilitarianism, or we don't need to go too deep into that. But the idea is that a liberal is a person who kind of thinks that everyone should have their rights protected from arbitrary abuses of power, from some horrible, powerful actor or actors doing things to them. And I think maybe one thing that's important to stress there, just to add, is that if you think carefully about that, that's a value, that kind of equal protection of rights has to apply uniformly to make any sense, right? And I think probably most people would, in the space, based on the talks earlier, already agree with that. If you've ever read Animal Farm, George Orwell tells us that we can't have some animals being more equal than others. So just for the purpose of our discussion, I think let's take liberalism to mean people who believe in these, like constitutionalism and liberty and equality and equal rights, okay? And then we'll move on from there to the question of how do we want to start thinking about Zionism and how do those fit together?
No, I think it's important, again, similarly with liberalism, I'm sure a lot of us know that there were lots of people throughout history who called themselves Zionists, but who described Zionism very differently. So while we are kind of drilling to the core in a way of what someone who would identify as a liberal would say, that they believe in kind of equality, democracy, but I think equality as a central principle it goes across all those who write from the liberal perspective. And at least I think those who consider themselves liberal Zionists would accept the importance of values like equality, democracy, freedom, etc. When it comes to Zionism, it's similar in that there were lots of people who called themselves Zionists, who wrote about Zionism, and who had kind of different ideas of what the ultimate project of this ideology was going to be. So when it comes to Zionism as an ideology in terms of its conception, we can look at all of the different kinds of strands of Zionism and say, well, there were certain versions of it that may be compatible with this principle of equality. There may have been certain writers who say, who wrote about a state in which it was just Jewish expression of kind of cultural life, a sense of spiritual connection. But when you look at the history of Zionist thought, the fundamental idea that kind of goes across most of those who are writing within the tradition, even within their different strands, is this idea of a Jewish state was fundamental. So the idea that what was going to be established, the product of the Zionist movement, if we're speaking pre-state of Israel, what was going to be established was a Jewish state. What did that mean? Well, for most of them, it meant that there was going to be a Jewish majority, demographic majority in that state. But what it also meant was that the state that was to be established was going to be one in which the interests of Jewish people and the Jewish population of the state would take priority over the interests of whatever other population may be part of that state. So in some ways, in us discussing liberal Zionism, we are speaking, we have to kind of drill to the core of what we think liberalism is. But when it comes to Zionism, there is this common thread throughout the works of Zionist thinkers that it's ultimately about creating a political entity in which the interests and rights of Jews would take priority over the interests and rights of the non-Jewish members of that population.
And that's quite, I mean, even from what we've already said, if we think of liberalism as being equal rights for everyone, and straight away we start talking about Zionism as prioritizing some people's rights over others, we've already got quite quickly a disconnect.
Yeah.
And so I wonder, I mean, I know you've done work on this yourself. was there any attempt for early Zionist thinkers to reconcile these two, to find a clever way to put them together, or how did they describe the plans that they were hoping for?
So the plans, a lot of the kind of leadings, let me just say, so for example, just to satisfy those who have maybe read a bit more widely in terms of Zionism. So Arthur Hertzberg wrote a book called The Zionist Idea. And it's considered to be the kind of preeminent English language anthology of the works of Zionist thinkers. And his book includes 36 entries from 36 different people. So there is some diversity. I think that's what's important. And a lot of those who were writing did signal a kind of commitment to values that we would ascribe to liberal values. The problem with taking a kind of broad view of that and ignoring, I think, the dominant strands of Zionist thought is that when you look at the dominant strands of Zionist thought, there was an acknowledgement that what was, well, not an explicit acknowledgement, but when you read their works, it becomes clear that what was envisioned was not a kind of society that's compatible with the values of democracy and freedom.
Right. So you're saying sort of in the way that Herzl, Jabotinsky, Ben-Gurion, they sort of all talked about transfer and,
Yeah. So you have this kind of euphemistic label of the word transfer. So if you look at a lot of the writings of people like Jabotinsky, Herzl, Weizmann, in private correspondence, they supported this idea of transfer of the local population because there was the need to create a Jewish demographic majority. And speaking of like the ingathering of exiles, for example.
And to be clear, transfer is literally a euphemism for you. It's inconvenient for me that you're here. I'm going to move you somewhere else.
Yeah, well, it was either moving out or the establishment, the idea that the establishment of the Jewish state would cause people to leave. This idea that they would leave voluntarily, but it was euphemism for ethnic cleansing. What actually?
Right. I mean, it's not a very liberal idea, I think, to sort of go, this is a nice bit of land. I would like it for myself and my friends. Everyone else, get a move on.
Yeah. Well, so I think that's the first thing if we're looking at Zionism at its conception, because we often see this debate when it comes to thinking about Zionism as the nature of the ideology of, well, initially it was a good idea, but it then became quite bad and it became quite evil. And people put different pinpoints on when that happened. So some might say, well, initially, Zionism was a good idea, but then as soon as the state of Israel was established, something, the material reality shifted and things were different. Some pinpointed at 67, some even will say now is when Zionism started to become a bad idea. But when we look at it from the beginning, there were two acknowledgements that I think are quite important. The first is that the leading Zionist thinkers, and when I say the leading Zionist thinkers, I'm rarely speaking, and this is for those again who have read in the area. I'm rarely talking about people like Theodor Herzl, Chaim Weizmann, Nachman Syrkin, Ber Barakov, and Vladimir Jabotinsky, which are kind of the chief ideologues of all of the main leading schools of Zionist thought. There were two things that they accepted. The first was that Palestinians, the indigenous population, would form part of the population of the state that was to be established in Palestine. The second was that some Palestinians would leave or be pushed out or be transferred. So we see both of those come out of the original kind of writings about what was still to be established, which I think should cause us to reconsider whether Zionism at its conception was an ideology that was compatible with equality. If you are to establish a Jewish state in which at least part of the population, if not the majority of the population, are not Jewish, what does that mean for those people's rights and interests and concerns? Similarly, if you are to establish a state in which the majority of the population has either fled or been pushed out, and you don't give them the right to return to that state, but you give another national group the right to return or to go to that state, that, again, it becomes incompatible with the principle of equality. And it's something that comes from early works and not something that's later.
So we're not going to speak for that long. We will open up to interaction soon. I mean, I did want to, based on what you were saying now, Caitlin, and I mean, it's interesting on this JDI page that people have seen. There is a quotation from the founding document of Israel's Declaration of Independence, which says the state will be based on the precepts of liberty, justice, peace, uphold the full social and political equality of all its citizens. I mean, and JDI then says, great, we like that. And the question is, I guess, how do we make sense of the fact that the historical record and the writings of early Zionists was pretty clear that this isn't what they were going to do, but then, make an announcement of a country and you're like, now we're going to do this stuff, guys. I mean, were they speaking through their teeth? Was it doublethink? Was it, how do you think that works?
Oh, it's a hard question. I can't get into their minds. If I could, I think, this would be probably a different conversation. But I think that the 48 Declaration of Independence must, one, be read in the context of its time. It obviously also has a relation to the partition resolution, which used similar kind of language. But we saw that even the partition resolution never came to fruition. There have never been two independent states that have both had full sovereignty in terms of a state. So I think the Declaration of Independence should be read within its time, but this wasn't the kind of language that the early Zionist thinkers used when they were describing the type of political society that was going to be established in Palestine.
And then if we're coming from their early thinking to, okay, there's this statement of rainbow flags and so on, we start to then talk about once Israel's established, what is the material reality of the country? Because I must say, my mother sitting over there is a history teacher, very interested in the history of the thinking. But I also think at some stage we should understand Zionism in terms of what has Zionism been concretely in the world. And that's the state of Israel, essentially. It's created that. It's been embodied in that. And the question then becomes, has the state of Israel ever been a version of something we could call seriously liberal or valuing of equality?
Yeah. And I think when you look at least from its early days, it's not really like that. So there have been, even from its earliest laws, one of the first laws that was statutes that was passed by the Knesset was called the Absentees Property Law, passed in 1950. And what that law sought to do was to dispossess people who owned, enjoyed, or held property located within the region. So within the portion of Palestine that the newly established state of Israel began to exercise sovereignty over, whether they could, it dispossessed people of those properties. Initially, when you look at the law on its face, it seems quite neutral. It doesn't mention Jewish, non-Jewish, but it creates certain categories of people to whom their property was dispossessed. And when you look at the categories, it becomes clear that it was to exclude all Jewish people or institutions from who was marked for dispossession. Once that happened, once the land was basically expropriated by the state, it would then vest in an Israeli state institution, which was to use that property for the benefit of the Jewish population in the state of Israel. So this is just one of the earlier kind of laws that paved the way for what became quite an unequal society. The second is the well-known law of return, also passed in 1950. So the two kind of came together. While land was now changing hands, the ingathering of exiles, to use the language of, I think, Weizmann, the ingathering of the exiles happens through this law of return. And what the law of return does is it entitles all of us, obviously, to go and acquire citizenship in Palestine or in the newly established state of Israel. But interestingly enough, there's an exception in the law of return. I just actually wanted to mention this. So every Jewish person in the world is entitled to migrate to and settle in Israel, except if you are deemed by the Minister of, I guess like the Minister of Home Affairs, there you are. If you're deemed to be engaged in an activity directed against the Jewish people. So if you're deemed to be engaged in a dangerous activity, then you can't.
If they found our podcast,
we might not be able to. So all this talk about revoking the law of return, we might be excluded from it anyway. But all this to say, the law of return establishes this pathway to citizenship that when you look at it on its, actually, it it does distinguish between Jewish people outside and Palestinians who were transferred, to use that language.
And this is something I want to come in on again, because I just think, I mean, when there is this discourse about maybe Zionism was liberal and became less liberal over time, well, this is like a key foundational law that has engineered the Israeli state we have today, that has engineered and preserved and maintained a Jewish majority, which is, for most, I think, Zionists, what a Jewish state means is a Jewish majority state. The law of return does this. And I think, for me, there's something quite devious about it being called the law of return, as opposed to the law of guaranteeing Jewish majorities, because it's not like Palestinian people who were chased away are able to use the law of return to come back. And in fact, this is one of the foundational grievances and demands of Palestinians for decades now, to have the right to return. So I think it's really important to look at it and go, and personally, this is kind of how I feel about liberal Zionism as well. It's a misnaming. And I think the law of return is a misnaming, because what the law of return does there are many countries in the world which offer these kinds of, I mean, especially European countries, ancestral, your family was chased away, you can now go get citizenship. That is not what the law of return is doing. It's not looking at, did someone 2 generations up in your family get chased away? It's looking at, are you Jewish? If yes, welcome. If no, goodbye. Right? Which to me is just about the clearest example of, from the start of the Israeli state, a commitment to engineering inequality and supremacy.
Yeah, and if you look, I mean, at more recent reports, it's this kind of the impact of that comes through in like Human Rights Watch's reports about Jewish supremacy, apartheid, B'Tselem's reports, Amnesty's reports. We see more recently how the system that was set up in the early days has engineered, further discrimination and breaches basically all of the laws against racial discrimination internationally. The last kind of law that I think should mention, and it contrasts with the Declaration of Independence, is the more recent basic law. Israel is the nation state of the Jewish people. And I think it's interesting, given that we know that the state of Israel obviously has non-Jewish population. And what the basic law does, or the nation state law, what it's often called, does is it declares obviously Hebrew as the official language. Arabic is then relegated to a point of having special status. The land of Israel, so it talks about the land of Israel rather than the state of Israel. This land of Israel between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River is declared as the historical homeland of the Jewish people, and that it is the nation state of the Jewish people. But then the section that's often gets quoted a lot, and I think, again, this echoes what was said many, many decades before, that the realization of the right to national self-determination in the state of Israel is exclusive to the Jewish people. And when we look back at some of the earlier writings, this is exactly the kind of political entity that was imagined. Weizmann talks about our Palestine and the aspirations of the Jewish people to have a home that they kind of control in this area, to have a society in which they are the kind of dominant ethnic group in which their rights and interests can be prioritized. We see that language being echoed more recently. So it's not, I think where this lands for me is that it's not a function of a recent, more kind of extreme government, but it has traces back to Zionism at its conception. And that when we are to align ourselves to this ideology, we also have to reckon with the fact that a lot of this was part of the vision that these early Zionist thinkers articulated quite clearly and starkly in their work.
So we end up with a question of, okay, so could there ever be an idea of liberal transfer, liberal ethnic cleansing, liberal social engineering, liberal occupation, liberal apartheid? And now we get to the point we're getting to today. Can there be liberal genocide, liberal fascism? Look, I think it's an important question for us to reckon with about when people want to talk about liberal Zionism, where is that coming from? I mean, one thing I want to bring up is there was a survey that was done by I wouldn't call it a liberal institution at all, the Jewish Federation of North America earlier this year, where they found that only 37% of Jewish respondents today identify as Zionists. And yet, about 80%, the overwhelming majority, said that they feel emotional attachment to Israel, that they want there to be an Israeli state. And so the question becomes, well, what is there's a kind of interesting disconnect between people's movement on the word Zionism, the idea of Zionism, but still having that connection. And I think for me, where I sit on this is kind of what we're discussing here, and I think what we agree on is, to the extent that you want to keep intact your idea of liberalism and also your affection for or attachment to some idea of a Jewish state, the onus is really on you to articulate a different version of that to the one that's existed for all of time. And I don't think you get to have it both ways. You either have to give a totally different version, or you have to say, you know what, I'm actually not a liberal. That's what I think.
No, but I think part of the kind of danger is that liberalism, for much of Israel's history, for much of Israel's life, or I mean, more than our lives, has been the kind of dominant or hegemonic ideology. I think in the last 5 years, it seems like maybe it's fascism. but to align yourself with liberal values or liberal institutions like the United Nations, etc., international law principles, it gives legitimacy to certain ideologies. And I think for me, the particular danger with liberal Zionism, even though I think we can honestly say that in some ways it is a better version than Smotrich and Ben-Gvir's Zionism, and I think we have to be honest about that. I think it's a double-edged sword in some ways, and there's a danger that we, by aligning this ideology, the ideology that paves the foundation for a Jewish state, with something like liberalism, we sanitize something that is harmful and that has and continues to cause harm.
I agree with that. I mean, I definitely think it would be silly to deny that most liberal Zionists, for example, say they oppose the occupation, and if the occupation were to end, that would be good. So it's not to say that there's nothing that I, as an anti-Zionist, have in common with a liberal Zionist in the views that I have. The question at some stage becomes about the language, and sometimes people, get obsessed with, well, should you change the way you use the language? Should we change the way we use the language? And I think where I fall on this, it's kind of what there are the best intentioned liberal Zionists seem to think that they can use liberalism to rescue Zionism. And I think what you're saying, and what I agree with, is that rather than that, what's happened as a matter of fact is liberalism has been used to extend the lifespan of Zionism. And what we need is for Zionism to die.
Yeah, and a state that actually is committed to equality and democracy to
yes.
Grow in its place.
Well, again, and to be clear, I don't think there's anything wrong about a Jewish person feeling an affinity for Jerusalem and the land around Jerusalem, or an affinity for a certain practice or an attachment to an ideal. But the reality is, what Israel was planned to be and what Israel has always been, there is a problem with that,
No, I think most people, I think that the idea really here is that if you ascribe to the values of equality and democracy and freedom and liberty, then you should be against ethno-states and ethnocracies. And the truth is that the state of Israel was always envisioned as a Jewish ethnocracy. They may not have used the word ethnocracy, but in our current kind of political lexicon, that is the state that they were describing. And
to come back to something I said, and maybe a good way to wrap up at the start, is liberalism emerged initially actually as a response to these kinds of religious supremacist movements. And I mean, it's hard to say Israel's anything but. It's become more and more like that over time. I mean, I wanted to, silly little bit, we're here on Mandela Day, and so I think it's just worth saying, Nelson Mandela very famously at the end of his Rivonia trial speech said, "I have fought against white domination and I have fought against black domination." I think even the most charitable understanding of Zionism, or liberal Zionism, or whatever Zionism you want to talk about, can be understood to fight against Jews being dominated, perhaps. But it has never fought against Jews dominating. There's not been a version of Zionism or a version of the States of Israel that has taken seriously fighting against Jewish domination. And so I think if you want to take Mandela as a starting point, you know, for your value sets and for the progress we've made in this country, it's really, you know, we need to then examine that question of, are we actually against all domination, or are we against the domination that might hurt us?
Yeah, I think that's a good place to end. I think if there's any questions or comments or anger.
Hello.
That's it.
Hello. Hello. Dusan. Okay, so it's time for questions from the floor and from Johannesburg. But please, everybody, do not take this opportunity to grandstand and make a speech of your own. You're very welcome to become a presenter at a future JDI event. We're interested in your opinions now, but please share. Share the time. Brevity is the watchword. Anthony.
Well, you've presented your take on the thinkings of certain Zionist writers, but was expulsion of the non-Jewish population ever a policy of formal Zionist movements? As a National Jewish Agency, formal Zionist parties elsewhere, not right-wing like Roith, which is political parties, but the movements itself that led to the creation of the state. Was it ever actually a formal policy of them? Otherwise, if it's not, then I think you're misrepresenting. Come to another matter where I think you're misrepresenting is that you postulating that every Palestinian who left what became the state of Israel within a portion of mandatory Palestine was expelled. Now, I know that there was at least three, to my knowledge, reasons. One was voluntary departure, perhaps through fear or whatever. One was the instruction from the Arab command, get out of the way while we massacre the Jews. And the third would be the Jews pushing them in certain areas, which you can then subdivide into perhaps territorial ambitions, and the other would be just the exigencies of war, not to have a hostile population sitting in threatening us. So I think you are misrepresentative in the way you push things. There's also the acceptance of the Jewish institutions of the Balfour Declaration, which had one of its tenets that nothing would be done to prejudice the rights of any existing population, which was an accepted policy. So I just find the tenor of your presentation to be somewhat misrepresentational. I can go into other things as well, but I'll pause.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to, I'll respond to the 2 points of misrepresent. I think on the first point you mentioned, was it a official policy of the Zionist movement's expulsion? No, it wasn't. All of the Zionist thinkers that I referred to were all quite none of them explicitly in public work supported the idea of what they refer to in private writings as transfer. Transfer is ambiguous in that it can include the types of leaving that you mentioned, like voluntarily leaving or being encouraged by community members, leaders to leave. But it also included the kind of pushing out and ethnic cleansing that I would encourage you to look at Ilan Pape's work on the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, because he sets out that evidence in a lot of detail. And I think it shows exactly the mechanisms of how it worked on the ground. But in terms of their writings and the explicit project from the Zionist movement, no, they certainly were not advocating for expulsion. Even more than that, I mean, Ber Barachev was quite adamant. He rejected the notion that Zionists wanted to engage in what he called the odious crime of expelling the Arabs from Palestine. And he argues that Palestine has sufficient land to accommodate both Jews and what he calls Arabs. So best reading is that they envisioned the Palestinians actually forming part of the state, albeit in a position where they didn't have sovereignty or the right of jurisdiction, to use that language, in the state. But it was not an explicit project, an explicit point from a policy point in the Zionist movement. I don't think they would have gotten very far politically had they had that as an explicit policy point. So, I mean, yeah, I didn't intend to misrepresent. My intention was to just to show that they did privately support this idea of transfer. There's a lot of work done in terms of looking through all of these writers in terms of what they actually did support, but the Zionist movement itself didn't advocate for expulsion. The second...
I mean, Herzl was famously privately engaged with Cecil John Rhodes for advice about how to do colonialism better. So
yeah, so I think a lot of it happened in private correspondence and private meetings, but not in terms of the platform of the Zionist movement. And there's a lot of evidence of that. And then the second alleged misrepresentation is that every Palestinian left yeah, and I think I mentioned that earlier, that Ilan Pape details this really well among other of the new historians, that it wasn't all voluntary exit. A lot of it was what we call ethnic cleansing.
Well.
Okay, we're going to switch over to Johannesburg, who have a question.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. What struck me about the last question was there was one word that I think gets to the heart of the issue. That word was massacre. So I think that, yes, you presented important historical facts, Anthony and Caitlin, an important analysis. But what do you say to people who are saying, but what about my security? All of this is just words. All of this is just theory. Where is my security lodged? What do you say to that position and that argument?
Well, I mean, I think where I would start with that is that I would want to challenge the premise that Israel has made Jewish people more secure or safe. You know, I remember a speech that Gideon Levy made about 10 years ago where he said, you know, Netanyahu wants all the Jews to come to Israel, but then also wants all the Jews to be scared that there's constantly a nuclear threat against Israel. You know, it's a very strange double think there. My personal opinion as a Jewish person is that there's nothing that's made me less safe in the world than Israel. You know, so I think on an emotional level, I can respond by saying I understand that someone can emotionally feel an attachment to like, this thing makes me safe. But I think we need to then be honest with ourselves. And I mean, if I could offer an analogy where you compare to, say, just a basic interpersonal relationship, is a person safer in a relationship by having all the power? Is a person safe in a relationship by constraining the other person's ability to do things? Or is that not what we call an abusive relationship, a toxic relationship, an unhealthy relationship? And so I think safety comes from sharing risk and vulnerability and being equal in that state of uncertainty. And I think that's, I mean, forgive the phrase, but to almost bite the bullets, I think I'm prepared to say that the chase of Zionism in Israel to be 100% certainly guaranteed security has only achieved the opposite and only ever will achieve the opposite. And what we need instead is to accept that we are all human, we are all fragile, we are all mortal, and let's stop pretending that we can like define any insecurities in our life out of existence. If we're waiting for another question, I did also want to briefly say to the last question, sorry, Caitlin is the lawyer here. She deals in facts. I'm not so good at that, but my training is in philosophy. And so I did just want to say to this question of were all Palestinians expelled? Because we hear this all the time. What does it matter? You know, the law of return doesn't say Jews and Palestinians who were expelled, you know, it just says Jews. And so even if you've got some story about some other Palestinians, the reality of Israel and its laws and its policies are that they discriminate against all Palestinians and always have, right? It's not just these ones or those ones. And so I don't think we need to go into that specificity because the reality doesn't do that itself.
Hi, thank you. I think just a couple of observations and a sort of question in there. I think, first of all, I think it's really valuable historically to have an accurate narrative, because I think that the narrative is, a certain narrative is told and believed by people, and I think that informs their current day views. So I think that that's an important contribution. I guess the point I wanted to raise, and I'm stealing from what Avram Berg said this earlier today, and I don't know if you were here or heard him, but is he a Zionist? And he made the point, which sort of really struck me, that, you know, Zionism's finished. It finished in 1948, and that the use of the word Zionism now is a trigger. So it's actually a racist term because it's being used in a way, because of the way that it's used in the current context, that if you don't support Zionism, then you're, I don't know, you're anti-Semitic, or you're this or that, etc. And it'll only, you know, coalition can only be with Zionists, so it excludes Arab parties automatically, that sort of thing. So I guess the question to yourselves, in the context that I understand it, about liberal Zionism, is the use of the term Zionism useful, or is it labeling anyone that actually supports Israel as a state, or Israelis who I think, who are liberal Israelis, who actually confront a lot of anger and opposition and whatever, just because they come from Israel, and they may be supportive of peace and all the things and values that would define liberalism, but because you know, they get labeled as Zionists, and Zionism has a connotation globally and more broadly without being properly informed. And I guess the point is, if you go back to Avram Berg's point, is about Israeliness. Israel, you know, whatever the founders thought and said, there was a context, and there certainly have been periods in Israel's history where the majority have been in favor of a peaceful solution, and events and leadership and politics has got in the way. So I think there's just an issue around Israeliness, and the term Zionism is, you know, I think the point that Avram Berg raised is highly triggering and not always helpful. So I guess sort of question to you in terms of, you know, whether how that landed with you.
I mean, look, I think language and communication are complicated. I've encountered this a few times, particularly from Israelis, because I think within Israeli society, the word Zionism sort of stopped being used for a long time, and it was just some historical thing. In the diaspora, it's kind of, we've continued to talk about it and analyze it in that way. So I can understand from an Israeli perspective that can seem like now a loaded charge, because the rest of the world is kind of imposing its vision. At the same time, the language of Zionism and the ideas behind Zionism, and certainly the weaponization of Zionism is the only antidote to anti-Semitism and to protecting Jews, that is built into the power structures of all of geopolitics since Israel's inception. That's the reality, you know, and I think that needs to be confronted. And so in the same way, I mean, you made me think a little bit about, both of us were around UCT 10 years ago at the time of Rhodes Must Fall. And there's this question about the language of racism. What are we calling racist? And what are we, you know, and for those not familiar, you know, the student movement was very set on saying that racism is not just like you say something nasty to a person of a different race. It's about the structural and the institutional dynamics and so on. I think that realistically, Zionism describes structures for most, certainly for Palestinians who've suffered underneath them, but then also structures for example, what the US and Western allies have supported, the stories that they've told. I'm sympathetic to the fact that it's understood differently and heard differently by Israelis. I get that. But maybe there's also some onus on them to do the work of, okay, this word is weird to me, but what they're actually saying is that the way my society works is a bit messed up and needs to change. I'm not sure if that totally satisfies your question, but I do appreciate where you're coming from.
I think one thing I'll say is using the word Zionism, it has become a loaded term in some ways, in that, you know, you can call someone a Zionist and then we must now accept all sorts of things about that person without actually explaining. But what we can focus on is just this idea, or at least what I focus on, is the idea of a Jewish state. So whatever you call it, whether you call it Zionism, the idea that it is legitimate to have a state in which one ethnic, religious, national, however you classify the Jewish people, which one group has priority, their rights should be preferred, their interests should be preferred, their security should be preferred. As soon as you have a political arrangement like that, that's, for me, the idea that still has relevance today. We see it, for example, in the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance working definition of anti-Semitism. To call that state, that formation, that Jewish state formation, a racist endeavor or a racist project is classified as as an example of anti-Semitism. So there's relevance in terms of free speech. There's relevance, I think, in terms of this ideological foundation for all sorts of other things that are done and that continue to be done in the name of preserving the state of Israel. And I think what's giving it that force is actually an acceptance that Zionism is a legitimate ideology. If we want to take the word Zionism out, that the existence of a Jewish state is a legitimate political project or formation. I think that's what's beneath it. I'm okay to say we don't have to talk about that, but we should talk about that idea.
Well, and also, just sorry, one last thing, just to tag on. What we actually see in many global north countries right now, Australia, the US, etc., is Zionist lobbies trying to change the law to make Zionism a protected identity. That's what they're doing right now, right? And so then for you to say, well, actually, the onus on the progressives is to stop talking about Zionism while they're specifically digging in to weaponize it even further, I think it gets things the wrong way around. We need to first look at what's materially wrong. How do we rectify that?
Johannesburg.
Hello. Hi, a very quick question about what we define as policy. When the state archives were opened in Israel and the new historians such as Ilan Pape, who you've mentioned, Avi Shleim, and others like them, they uncovered Plan D, Plan Dalit, which was essentially a policy of ethnic cleansing. And so to me, it's quite clear that Israeli policy from the get-go actually was supportive and promoting ethnic cleansing. And that was at the very start of things.
No, I think it's helpful to mention Plan D. Yeah, again, read the new historians. Thanks.
So I think, okay. So I don't want to stand up if that's okay. I'm just going to speak from the chair. But so a lot of this conversation is centered around this notion of democracy underpinning the state of Israel. And at what point did this notion of democracy fall apart? And I don't know how many people in the audience are aware of a independent commission of inquiry and the CARP report that was released in 1984 already. And we think of this rise of settler violence as being something that's suddenly flared up after October 7th. But in fact, what was already becoming evident in 1984 was that people within the West Bank were being dispossessed of their homes, and that there was this architecture, there was cooperation between judiciary, police, settler, and IDF, all working in cohort to dispossess Palestinians of their land. And this was known by the Israeli government in 1984. So I think therein is the answer, that the state was aware. They knew that there was disparity in terms of how the judiciary was treating Palestinians. That's one thing. And another thing I wanted to bring up, because it all centers around, land, who gets access to land. And within Gaza, there's a fantastic Israeli journalist that I became aware of, Ari Flansrach. And one of the things that he was working on is within Gaza now, and you have all these refugee camps, And of course, Trump's peace plan, and they're all going to get carted off into these camps forcibly. But Israel is still kind of trying to cling to this thing that they're working legalistically. So apparently what he was examining is their Jordanian law, where they can't strip Palestinians outright of their ownership of the land. But what you can do when you've leveled a city or, area to the extent that Gaza has been leveled, is you can start to move those populations around and redraw the maps. And if you move them around and you keep redrawing the maps enough, you can eventually strip them of their ownership, which to me is terrifying. I mean, that's now the fullest expression of this state, which is not legal.
And thank you, but all I'd add to that is that how that connects for me to this question of the possibility of something like liberal Zionism is that, and it's part of what we were saying right at the end of our talk, is that allowing it to be within the framework of liberal discourse is what enables the possibility of, weaponizing and manipulating bureaucratic standards and norms to sort of like sneakily do these horrible things and get away with it. And so I think that's why, our position is, let's in the first place call a spade a spade. There's nothing liberal about this thing. And let's work from there, because if we try to protect the liberal version of it, we allow for the sustenance of that whole system of operations.
Yeah, and what you reminded me of was the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation and all of the horrors that, yeah.
Hang on, Glenn. Hang on, sorry.
Okay, so I've got a question. Bring the conversation back to liberal Zionists and who they are. A lot of people I've encountered myself, and I'm sure a lot of people in this room, are South African Jews who say, yes, I'm anti the current government in Israel. I'm anti the occupation. I think it's all terrible, but I'm still Zionist. These are the liberal Zionists. And my question to you, the bad Jews, is why do you think otherwise liberally minded people and people who self-describe as against oppression cling on to this label of Zionism so much?
I mean, honestly, yeah, I'm not an expert in this, but my sense is there's a deep emotional attachment. I think, when I used to teach philosophy, we talk about how people, when their beliefs are confronted by new experiences, change their beliefs. There's a philosopher called Quine who says that your beliefs face the tribunal of experience as a corporate body, not one at a time. And so you have this new experience, and then you sort of, which belief should I change? And usually you'll change one belief rather than 80,000. And I think when it comes to Zionists and their attachment to the idea of Zionism and what they believe about Zionism, it's honestly quite psychologically traumatic to be confronted by the reality and go, okay, all of these beliefs I've had my whole life, I just need to drop them now. And so it becomes a bit easier to find yourself making an excuse and saying, well, that's just this part of it. That's just this part of it. Maybe I can still have that part of it. And so I think there is that genuine difficulty that people have. But I also think that the world doesn't need to, while people are suffering at the hands of this ideology, the world doesn't need to wait for those people to catch up. We need to fix the world, and hopefully people who are struggling to catch up will be able to do that work as well.
Yeah, I don't really have, the one thing I would add is maybe more of a personal reflection. I would have considered myself, I wouldn't have called myself a liberal, but I probably would have considered myself a liberal Zionist in the sense that we're talking about, in the sense that you speak about it. A couple of years ago, like not too long ago, my kind of moments of shift came around the time of the Great March of Return and after that, which was in 2018. And I was always very vocally against the occupation. I used to get into Facebook fights with people back in high school. And I posted some article about the IDF doing some bad things in the West Bank, and I got hate from some of my classmates. I was called an extremist, feminist terrorist. I don't know where the feminist came in, but I wasn't really advocating such a radical. I didn't go beyond the pale in that I wasn't saying that we shouldn't have a Jewish state. But I think where I was stuck was on this idea of actually fundamentally questioning the existence of a Jewish state. I had accepted that it was something that was necessary at the time after the Holocaust, that Jews in the world didn't have anywhere to go, and I think I was scared of confronting the idea that we were engaged in something bad, and I needed to satisfy myself about the facts of what happened before I could get over that emotional hurt. It was a long process for me, and it was a long process of reading, and reading things that were really uncomfortable and having conversations that were really uncomfortable. And I think not everyone is in the place for that. But I always encourage people to do it, because when you come out on the other side, you feel a lot more empowered, and you feel actually felt a lot more connected to my Jewish identity, because it all made sense to me. It aligned with everything else that I believed. So it is hard, and I agree with Anthony. It's emotional and psychological in a big way, and communal. Yeah.
There's one more last question here, and then yeah.
Thank you very much. A comment rather than a question. Thank you very much for a very interesting discussion and all these wonderful questions and comments. Someone wrote, "Who is more reprehensible? He who steals the goose from the land, or the land from under the goose?" I think that is something we can think about, particularly in terms of this discussion and discussions about colonialism throughout the world. Thank you.
Do you want to answer that quickly? Okay. Thank you very much.
Glenn's desperately wanting to say something. I don't know if we don't want anyone to think the bad Jews don't want to talk to Glenn Hannock. So
right. So I'm with you, as I'm sure most people are, on colonialism, on historic ethnic cleansing, on the Nakba, on the necessity to end the occupation, and on reparations. So I'm a classic liberal Jew, let's say. I'm puzzled, however, on the idea that an ethno-state is a per se evil. I've discussed it informally. I'd like to hear you speak about it now, just for 2 minutes. And I'm going to set it up with 3 quotes, and I'm going to sit down. In the order in which they were made, John Stuart Mill, you mentioned him earlier, Caitlin. Free institutions, he says, are next to impossible in a society made up of different nationalities. The fundamental problem is there's a lack of fellow feeling. Moses Hess, the real pioneer of Zionism, as I'm sure you know, the precursor to Herzl, kind of worshipped him, and a lifelong socialist, had a famous quote, "Race is primary, class is secondary." And the most provocative of all, the most challenging of all, because it raises this question of what are countries, is Nassim Taleb, who said, "The nation state, apartheid without the political incorrectness." So basically what I'm asking you is, what is so bad about a state? Because it seems to me every of the 220 states in the world, probably 170 of them are nation states in a certain way. They are ethno-states. We call them nation states. But then you've got the secessionist movements, and you've got the self-determination movements. Yeah, I'm going on. But I'm genuinely interested, and I'd love to hear you on it, because I'm not hearing clarity on that at all. What is so bad about an ethno-state?
We at the end of the conversation, we can't answer all the questions. We can engage over supper and interact a little bit more. But thank you very much, Glenn, for the question. It's open-ended. We'll engage with this discussion moving forward.